Jonathan Briggs had seen a lot in his time as a bodyguard. He had been to war zones, dealt with high-profile clients, and protected the wealthiest of the wealthy. But nothing in his experience could have prepared him for this assignment. The Intergalactic Council had chosen him for a mission beyond anything he had ever imagined, a mission to protect Queen Alira of the Galthar. And if he thought the name sounded important, it was nothing compared to the reality of meeting her. Jonathan had prepared himself for the usual meetings with dignitaries and rulers, but when he stepped into the grand hall of the Galthar Palace and saw her, everything else seemed to disappear. Queen Alira stood at the center of the room, tall and regal, her shimmering purple skin glowing under the soft lights. Her hair, a cascade of silver tendrils, moved like liquid, and her golden eyes shone with a mix of power and mystery. Jonathan swallowed hard. It wasn't the alien features that had him nervous. He'd seen his share of strange beings, but the presence of the queen was something else. It was like she filled the entire room with a gravity that pulled everyone toward her. "You're the human bodyguard." Her voice was smooth, but there was a sharpness to it that made Jonathan's heart race. She looked him up and down, her golden eyes twinkling with amusement. "I must admit, I expected something stronger." Jonathan felt his cheeks flush. Well, that wasn't exactly a warm welcome. "I'm more than capable, Your Majesty," Jonathan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've got years of experience protecting high-profile clients. You won't find anyone better." Alira's lips curled into a playful smile, one that seemed to tease him more than reassure him. "We'll see about that, human. I'm not easily impressed." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, determined to keep his cool. "I'm sure I'll manage. I'm good at what I do." She took a few steps closer, the soft clink of her armor almost melodic. "You're certain, then?" Her voice dropped to a quieter, more dangerous tone. "You're not afraid to protect a queen like me?" Jonathan had a split second to think about how to respond. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, daring him to back down. Most people would have trembled under the intensity of it, but not Jonathan. His training kicked in, and a confident grin spread across his face. "Not afraid," he said with a wink. "I've dealt with tough situations before, but I'm not here to just protect you. I'm here to make sure you don't get hurt, and I'm good at that." Alira tilted her head, eyes narrowing in what looked like curiosity. She wasn't expecting that. "I like your spirit, human," she said softly. "But let's see how long that lasts when the real danger comes." Jonathan laughed, feeling a bit of the tension break. "I'll take my chances. Besides, I'm sure I can handle you just fine." Her smile widened, and for the first time, Jonathan saw a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "I think you might be interesting after all, but don't get too comfortable. You'll be tested more than you realize." The next few days were a blur of meetings, dinner parties, and endless royal protocol. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that Alira was constantly watching him, studying him. Every time their eyes met, there was a spark, a challenge, an understanding that went beyond words. She wasn't just the queen, she was a force. At one point, during a formal gathering, Alira leaned in close to Jonathan while they stood on the balcony overlooking the grand gardens. The night was warm, and the stars seemed closer here than anywhere else in the galaxy. "Tell me, human," she murmured, her voice low and full of mystery. "What do you think of me?" Jonathan hesitated. It was a question he didn't quite know how to answer. She was beautiful, powerful, and intimidating. But there was more to her than just her queenly demeanor. He felt it in the way she looked at him, the way she occasionally let down her guard just enough for him to catch a glimpse of vulnerability. He turned to face her, leaning slightly closer. I think you're a lot more than people give you credit for. You carry the weight of your empire on your shoulders, and I get the feeling that not even your closest advisors understand what that really feels like." Alira's eyes softened, and for the briefest of moments, Jonathan saw something different in them. Something that wasn't just the unapproachable queen, but a woman who had been forced to bear the weight of everything alone. "You may be right," she said quietly. "Not many see the real me. I'm always expected to be strong, to never falter." Jonathan nodded, his voice gentler. "I don't think anyone expects you to be perfect, but I know one thing: whatever happens, I've got your back, and I'm not going anywhere." Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The connection between them was undeniable. Jonathan didn't know what it was, but there was something about the Queen, something raw and real, that drew him in. And in that moment, Jonathan realized something. His mission wasn't just about protecting a ruler. It was about protecting a woman who, despite all her power, needed someone to stand beside her. Maybe this mission wouldn't be as simple as he thought, but one thing was for sure: he wasn't backing down. The sparks between them were just beginning to light. Days passed, and Jonathan couldn't deny that the tension between him and Queen Alira was growing. Every interaction left him feeling like he was walking a fine line between professionalism and something deeper, something unspoken. He tried to stay focused on his mission, but it wasn't easy when every time he turned around, she was there, staring at him with those golden eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. At first, he chalked it up to her being a queen, always observing, always calculating. But as the days went on, he began to wonder if there was more to it. Her teasing glances, the way she'd brush against him in crowded hallways, the small but significant touches, everything seemed to suggest that Alira wasn't just playing the role of a distant ruler. She was intrigued by him, maybe even attracted. That thought sent a jolt through Jonathan every time it crossed his mind. He knew better than to fall for a queen, especially one who was as powerful and untouchable as Alira. But that didn't make the pull between them any less real. It was a particularly long day, filled with tense meetings and political maneuvering. Alira had to navigate a complex gathering of the Empire's most influential leaders, and Jonathan had to keep a sharp eye on every corner of the palace, making sure no one got too close to her. As they made their way through a grand hallway after the meeting, Jonathan couldn't help but notice how the Queen moved. With every step, her grace was undeniable, yet her movements were full of purpose. She had the poise of someone who had been groomed for power since birth. "You're quiet today, human," Alira remarked, glancing over her shoulder at him. "What's on your mind?" Jonathan cleared his throat, feeling a little caught off guard. "Just thinking about how this mission is turning into more of a workout than I signed up for," he said, his tone light but with a hint of teasing. "Keeping up with you isn't as easy as it looks." Alira chuckled softly, the sound carrying a hint of amusement. "I should hope not. You are here to protect me, after all. I'd hate to think that your job is too easy." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, his smirk growing. "Easy? Hardly. It's just that I didn't realize how much running after a queen would be part of the job description." Alira stopped in her tracks and turned to face him, her eyes narrowing playfully. "You think I'm a handful, don't you?" Jonathan met her gaze, not backing down. "Well, let's just say I'm not used to chasing royalty around." She took a step closer, her gaze locking with his in a way that made Jonathan's heart skip a beat. "You haven't even seen the half of it, human." The intensity in her eyes sent a wave of heat rushing through Jonathan. He had to look away, trying to regain his composure. "I've got plenty of time to catch up," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Alira smiled, her expression softening, but there was still a teasing edge to it. "I'm sure you do, but be careful, Jonathan. Not everything that glitters is gold." His heart raced at the way she said his name. "I'm not worried about gold, Your Majesty," he replied. "I'm more concerned about you." For a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with something electric, and Jonathan found himself holding his breath, waiting for her to respond. But before she could, a sudden shout from down the hallway broke the spell. "Assassins!" someone yelled, their voice filled with panic. Without thinking, Jonathan grabbed Alira's arm and yanked her toward the nearest doorway. He barely had time to think as his training kicked in. He could hear footsteps pounding closer, and he knew they didn't have much time. "Stay close to me," Jonathan ordered, his voice sharp as he guided her down a narrow corridor. Alira didn't argue. She followed his lead, her usual confidence replaced with something more uncertain. Jonathan's mind raced as they moved quickly, the sound of footsteps growing louder. Whoever was coming after them wasn't wasting time. "Do you have any idea who they are?" Jonathan asked, keeping his voice low. "I do," Alira replied, her expression serious. "They're part of a faction within my council. They don't like the changes I'm making. They want me gone." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We'll make sure that doesn't happen." They reached a dead end at the end of the corridor, but Jonathan wasn't about to back down. He pushed open a door, leading them into a hidden stairwell that led to a small, secure room. As they entered, Jonathan pushed the door shut behind them, his heart still pounding. For a moment they just stood there, catching their breath. The silence between them felt heavier than it ever had before. Jonathan was acutely aware of the closeness between them, how her breath was still uneven, how her golden eyes were watching him carefully. "You're always saving me, human," Alira said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "First from the council's plots, now from assassins. Why do you keep doing it?" Jonathan met her gaze, his voice quieter now. "Because you're worth saving. I'll always protect you, Alira, no matter what." She looked at him, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something more. But instead she simply nodded, her gaze softening. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, of connection, that lingered between them. Before they could speak again, the door slammed open, and Jonathan instinctively stepped in front of Alira, ready for whatever came next. But when he turned to face the intruder, he found no threat, just another member of her royal guard. "Your Majesty," the guard said, breathless, "we've taken care of the assassins. The palace is secure again." Alira let out a sigh of relief, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The danger wasn't over. He just didn't know how close it was getting. As they left the room, walking back into the palace corridors, Jonathan couldn't help but feel like they were both on the edge of something more than just a bodyguard's duty. And though he tried to ignore it, the growing tension between him and Alira was impossible to deny. For the first time, he wondered if they were both in danger, not just from the enemies around them, but from something far more personal. The spark between them was there, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. The days after the assassination attempt passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Jonathan had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, but something about the danger they had just faced, and the way Alira had looked at him afterward, was gnawing at him. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. There was a weight in her eyes when she looked at him, one that spoke of trust, fear, and something else that Jonathan couldn't quite place. He tried to shake it off. They were allies, after all. He was there to protect her. That's all. But the more time he spent in her presence, the more he felt like the line between duty and something deeper was blurring. It didn't help that Alira wasn't making it easy. She seemed to be everywhere. Every time he turned around, she was there, her golden eyes full of intrigue and her lips curling into that playful, teasing smile that made his heart race. "Do you ever stop looking so serious?" she asked one morning as they stood in the royal gardens, watching the sun rise over the massive palace. Jonathan had been on alert since sunrise, his eyes scanning every corner of the area for threats. But the more he tried to focus on the mission, the more distracted he became by the way Alira's presence filled the space around him. "I'm just doing my job," Jonathan said, trying to play it cool. "You know, protecting the most important person in the galaxy." Alira chuckled, stepping closer to him. "You make it sound like a chore," she teased. "I'm not that dangerous, am I?" Jonathan looked at her, the familiar spark in her eyes making him smile despite himself. "You don't make it easy, that's for sure." Her eyes narrowed playfully and she stepped even closer. "Is that so? Well, maybe I should make things harder for you then, a real challenge. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. I think I've got enough challenges already, Your Majesty. But before either of them could say more, a loud crash echoed through the gardens, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps. Jonathan's instincts kicked in immediately and he spun to face the threat. But it wasn't just one person. It was a group, moving swiftly through the foliage, clearly aiming for Alira. Get down, Jonathan shouted, pulling her out of harm's way just as a volley of energy blasts rang out. Alira's heart raced as she tried to follow Jonathan's lead, but the sudden chaos was enough to throw her off balance. Jonathan shoved her behind a pillar, his body instinctively taking the brunt of the fire as he shielded her from the incoming blasts. Stay behind me, Jonathan commanded, his voice sharp. But Alira wasn't the type to cower in fear. She peeked around the corner, watching the attackers, her eyes narrowed in fury. I'm not just going to hide, Jonathan. We need to fight back. Jonathan growled under his breath, but he didn't argue. Fine, but stay close. This isn't like last time. These guys came prepared. The attackers were ruthless, and Jonathan quickly realized they weren't just ordinary mercenaries. They were part of a well-organized faction within her own kingdom, plotting to take her down. He could see the unmistakable insignia on their armor, the mark of a rebel group that had been stirring up trouble for months. Stay low, Jonathan shouted, pulling Alira out from behind the pillar. He threw a quick look at the group advancing toward them, trying to gauge their numbers. Alira's breath was rapid, but her focus was razor-sharp. I knew they were planning something like this, she said between breaths. I just didn't expect it to happen this soon. You've got a target on your back, Jonathan muttered, still scanning for an escape route. We need to move. Just then, one of the rebels lunged toward them with a blaster raised, and Jonathan barely had time to react before the man's weapon was torn from his hands. Alira's eyes glowed with a fierce energy as she used her telekinetic abilities to throw him back with such force that he collided with a wall. Jonathan stared at her, awestruck. You didn't tell me you could do that. She gave him a small, triumphant smile. There's a lot you don't know about me, human. Before Jonathan could respond, another attacker rushed at them, but this time it wasn't just the rebel. There were too many for them to handle alone. Jonathan's heart was pounding as he realized they needed to get out of there fast. Alira, he said urgently, pulling her toward the palace gates, we need to go now. The two of them sprinted through the garden, weaving between trees and statues, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. Jonathan's mind raced as he pushed Alira to move faster. But the rebels were closing in, and it was clear they were determined. As they neared the palace gates, one of the rebels grabbed Alira's arm, yanking her back. Jonathan reacted instantly, pulling the attacker off her and throwing him to the ground, but it slowed them down. Go, Jonathan shouted, pushing Alira ahead of him as he continued to fight off the attackers. Alira stumbled forward, but her legs were strong, her determination greater than ever. She turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. Jonathan. Go, he shouted again, his voice sharp with urgency. She hesitated for a second longer, but then she ran, making her way through the gates. Jonathan followed close behind, fighting off another attacker as they finally broke free from the immediate danger. They ran, their footsteps growing more frantic as they reached the palace's safe room. Once inside, Jonathan slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. His heart was racing, his body sore from the fight. But when he turned to look at Alira, he found her standing there, breathing heavily but unharmed. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The adrenaline was still coursing through them, and the tension between them had shifted once again. Are you all right? Jonathan asked, his voice softer now, filled with concern. Alira nodded, but her gaze didn't leave his. I'm fine, thanks to you. Jonathan didn't know what to say. His chest tightened as he realized just how much he cared for her, how deeply he'd become attached in such a short amount of time. "You're welcome," he said, his voice barely a whisper. And in that moment, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, their connection seemed to deepen in a way that neither of them could ignore. Whatever was happening between them, whatever this was, it wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was something real. And neither of them knew what would happen next, but they both knew one thing: whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days after the ambush had been a whirlwind of activity. Jonathan and Alira barely had time to catch their breath. The palace had been fortified, guards doubled, and the royal council had been scrambling to find out who was behind the attack. But in the middle of it all, there was a quiet tension that neither of them could escape. Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about the way Alira had looked at him when he pulled her to safety, how she trusted him, how she seemed to need him in a way that went beyond their usual professional relationship. The realization had hit him like a thunderclap. He wasn't just protecting the queen anymore. He was protecting someone he was beginning to care for deeply. Alira, too, seemed unsettled. He saw it in the way she walked now, more carefully, as if she wasn't sure what to make of him, or the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. Her playful remarks had taken on a deeper edge, and Jonathan found himself responding to her with the same mix of humor and something far more intense. That night, after another long, exhausting day of planning and security measures, Alira found herself standing on the balcony of the royal quarters, staring out into the night. The stars looked so far away, and the palace felt strangely quiet, as if the whole world had fallen silent. She had a lot to think about. The constant danger was one thing, but there was something more, something between her and Jonathan that neither of them had acknowledged yet. Her position as queen demanded strength, but there was a part of her that longed to be vulnerable, to feel safe. And Jonathan, he made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Jonathan's voice broke through her thoughts. Alira turned around, finding him standing in the doorway, a soft smile on his face. His eyes were tired, but there was something else in them too, a warmth that she couldn't ignore. He was watching her not as a queen, but as a woman. "It is," Alira replied, her voice soft, "though it feels lonely sometimes." Jonathan stepped out onto the balcony, standing a little distance away from her, but still close enough that their presence filled the space between them. "You're not alone, you know," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Alira turned to face him fully, raising an eyebrow. "A little hard to believe when you're surrounded by enemies and political schemers." Jonathan's lips twitched in a half-smile. "Yeah, I guess I get that, but you've got me right." She met his gaze, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of what he was offering. The warmth in his words wasn't just about duty, it was personal. He wasn't just there to protect her. He was there for her, in a way that felt deeper, more real. "You know," she said, her voice quieter now, "I've never been good at letting people get close. Not even my own people. I've always had to keep a wall up for my own safety, for the Empire's safety." Jonathan nodded, understanding all too well. "I get it, but walls like that, they're heavy, aren't they?" She exhaled, her gaze drifting back to the stars. "You don't know the half of it. Being queen means never showing weakness, never letting anyone see the cracks. But sometimes I wonder if that's even possible, if I can keep going like this without falling apart." Jonathan's heart clenched at the rawness in her voice. He stepped closer, but not too close, giving her space while still showing his presence. "You don't have to be perfect, Alira. I've seen you fight like a warrior, protect your people, and still care for them. You don't have to carry it all alone." For a long moment she said nothing, just standing there in the stillness of the night. Jonathan wasn't sure if she was processing his words or if she was simply lost in thought. But when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I'm scared, Jonathan," she admitted, her eyes meeting his. "Scared that I'll lose everything. Scared that I'll end up alone like all the other queens before me. I can't let that happen. I can't let them win." Jonathan's heart swelled with emotion as he took a step closer, his voice gentle. "You're not alone. You don't have to face this by yourself. I'm right here, Alira. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, searching his eyes as if looking for the truth behind his words. Then, without a word, she closed the distance between them, standing so close now that Jonathan could feel the warmth of her presence. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. And then, as if something invisible had snapped, Alira reached out, cupping Jonathan's face in her hands. His breath caught in his throat as her touch sent a shiver down his spine. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest as he stared down at her, caught in the weight of the moment. He had never seen her like this, vulnerable, fragile in a way that was so different from the powerful queen he had first met. "I won't," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, Alira, not now, not ever." And then, without another word, she kissed him. It was slow, hesitant at first, as if neither of them was sure what the next step was. But it didn't matter. In that moment, everything else faded away, the political scheming, the threats, the uncertainty. There was only the two of them standing together in the quiet of the night, letting everything else melt away. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and slightly disoriented, Alira rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing as if trying to hold on to the moment. "I don't deserve you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jonathan smiled, his hand gently brushing her hair back from her face. "You deserve more than anyone I've ever met." And for the first time in days, both of them allowed themselves to believe it. In that moment, the weight of the world seemed a little less heavy, and Jonathan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The days following their quiet, intimate moment on the balcony were a blur of emotions and uncertainties. The world outside was still a storm of political unrest, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was brewing. It was clear that the enemies of Queen Alira weren't done with her yet, and the threats had only grown more intense. Alira, though she tried to appear unshaken, was different now. The vulnerability she had shown him in the quiet of the night stayed with him, and Jonathan found himself thinking of her constantly, not just as his queen, but as someone he was beginning to love more deeply than he ever expected. But as much as he wanted to keep her safe, the reality of their situation was starting to feel heavier. The palace was still in lockdown, and Jonathan spent every waking moment scanning for threats. Despite the ever-present danger, Alira refused to stay hidden in her quarters. She was the queen, after all, and she had a duty to her people. One morning, Jonathan walked into the palace's war room, expecting a routine briefing. Instead, he found the entire council gathered, including Lord Kalen, a high-ranking Galthar noble whose face had begun to show up more often lately. Jonathan didn't trust him, not one bit. There was something in the way Kalen looked at Alira, something possessive and calculating. "Ah, Jonathan," Kalen said, his tone oily and smooth. "Always on guard, I see. Is there any real need for a human to be here? Surely, our own forces are enough to handle the Queen's safety." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly where this was going. Kalen had always been dismissive of humans, but the bitterness in his voice went beyond that. The noble had been pushing for more influence over the Queen's affairs for months. And now, with Alira's safety at risk, Jonathan feared Kalen was trying to use the chaos to his advantage. "Lord Kalen," Jonathan said coolly, not allowing his anger to show, "it's my job to make sure the Queen stays alive. If that means I'm here, then I'm here. We don't have time to argue about this." Alira, who had been standing at the head of the table, watching the exchange with quiet intensity, spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Jonathan stays. He is my bodyguard and I trust him." Kalen's lips twisted in a thin smile. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "You do have quite a fondness for your human protector, don't you?" Jonathan stiffened, but Alira didn't flinch. She met Kaelin's gaze with a coolness that made Jonathan's chest swell with pride. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. "You're pushing it, Lord Kaelin," Alira said, her voice low and icy. "We have more important matters to discuss than your petty jealousy." Kaelin's expression darkened for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a smooth smile. "Of course, Your Majesty. My apologies." He turned his gaze to Jonathan, the challenge clear in his eyes. "Let's hope the human is as capable as he claims." Jonathan didn't back down, but he knew he had to keep his temper in check. If Kaelin thought he could provoke him, he was wrong. Alira's safety was more important than a petty rivalry. As the meeting continued, Jonathan's thoughts kept drifting back to the tension between Kaelin and Alira. He could see it, the way Kaelin looked at her like he wanted something more, and the way Alira responded with such icy control only made it worse. Jonathan hated seeing her like this, hated that someone like Kaelin was trying to worm his way into her life, using charm and manipulation as his weapons. After the meeting, Alira and Jonathan stepped out onto the balcony, the weight of the discussion still hanging in the air. "You handled that well," Alira said, her voice soft but appreciative. Jonathan shrugged, trying to act casual, though he could still feel the adrenaline from the confrontation. "I'm just doing my job, but Kaelin, there's something about him I don't trust." Alira sighed, leaning against the railing and gazing out at the stars. "I know, he's ambitious, always has been. He thinks he can take my place, but he doesn't realize that the throne isn't just about power, it's about responsibility." Jonathan's heart clenched as he watched her, the vulnerability in her voice pulling at him. He knew she carried the weight of her empire on her shoulders, but he hated how she had to carry it alone. And now, with Kaelin's advances, it seemed like she might have even more on her plate. "You don't have to do this alone, Alira," Jonathan said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to carry the empire and deal with people like him on your own. I'm here for you. You can lean on me." Alira turned to face him, her golden eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Then slowly, she stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Jonathan's heart raced as he looked at her, his own emotions rising. He had never expected to feel this way about her, about anyone. But standing there with her, feeling her presence so close, he knew he couldn't deny it any longer. "I'm not going anywhere, Alira," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving you." She gave him a small, grateful smile, but there was something more in her gaze. It was a mixture of affection and something else, something deeper. Jonathan leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time since they had met, he kissed her. It was soft, tentative at first, as if they were both testing the waters, but as the kiss deepened, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them, and for the first time in days, Jonathan felt like everything might be okay. As they pulled away, their foreheads rested together and Alira sighed softly. "I'm scared, Jonathan," she admitted in a whisper. "I don't know what Kaelin will do next, and I don't want to lose you." Jonathan's hand gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "You won't lose me, I promise." But deep down, he knew the dangers weren't over yet. Kaelin wouldn't give up so easily. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Jonathan was ready to face them. For Alira, for them. Whatever it took, he would stand by her side. The tension in the palace was unbearable. Jonathan could feel it in his bones, the quiet before the storm. Every day, he watched Alira with a protective eye, knowing that more trouble was coming. The political unrest was escalating, and whispers of an impending invasion from a rival empire began to spread. The threat to Alira's life was no longer just from assassins or political rivals, but from a full-scale war. For Alira, it was even worse. She could see the walls closing in on her from every direction. She was the queen, but in many ways she felt like a pawn in a game she could never control. Kaelin was pushing harder than ever, using the war as a way to undermine her rule. His influence was growing, and he wasn't shy about it. Every time he stepped into a room, Jonathan could feel the underlying challenge in his gaze. Kalen wanted the throne, and he'd do anything to get it. But Jonathan refused to let Alira face this alone. His loyalty to her had grown beyond duty. He'd come to care for her more than he ever expected. There was a bond between them now, one that went beyond the job he was hired to do, and with every passing day, that bond only grew stronger. One night, as they sat in her private quarters, strategizing their next move, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Jonathan was on his feet in an instant, his heart racing. He pulled Alira behind him, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. "What was that?" Alira asked, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know, but we're not taking any chances," Jonathan replied, his voice low and steady. The crash was followed by a series of loud shouts. Jonathan's instincts screamed at him to protect her, and without another word he moved toward the door, motioning for Alira to stay close. They had to get out of the palace, now. But as they reached the hallway, Jonathan's eyes went wide with shock. A group of masked soldiers, armed and ready, were already storming the palace. They weren't just after Alira. They were here to take control, to force her to surrender. "Get back!" Jonathan shouted, shoving Alira behind him as he unsheathed his weapon. The attackers didn't hesitate. They were quick and efficient, but Jonathan had been trained for moments like this. He fought with precision, his every move calculated as he took down one assailant after another. But the numbers were growing, and there were too many of them. Alira watched in horror as Jonathan fought to protect her. She could feel her heart racing in her chest. She wasn't used to being helpless. She was the queen. She should be the one in control. But in that moment, she realized that she couldn't do this alone. She needed Jonathan more than she had ever needed anyone. With a sudden surge of power, she reached out, using her telekinetic abilities to hurl one of the soldiers across the room. The man crashed into a wall with a sickening thud, unconscious before he hit the floor. Jonathan glanced back at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Alira, how did you?" "I've been holding back," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I won't let them take me." The sight of her standing strong, using her powers to protect them both, gave Jonathan a new level of admiration for her. She wasn't just a queen. She was a force to be reckoned with. Together, they fought their way through the palace, Jonathan's skill and Alira's powers complementing each other perfectly. But as they neared the palace gates, a sharp cry cut through the air. "Your Majesty," a guard shouted, rushing toward them. "The enemy has taken the main gates. We're trapped." Alira's heart sank. The gates were their only way out. Without them, they were cornered. She glanced at Jonathan, who was already scanning the surroundings for an escape route. "Not yet," he said firmly. "We're not finished." Jonathan pulled her toward a hidden passage they had discovered days earlier, one that led to a secret underground tunnel. It wasn't the safest route, but it was their best shot. Alira hesitated for a moment, fear creeping into her chest. But then she saw the determination in Jonathan's eyes, and she knew he was right. They had to keep moving. They hurried through the narrow passage, Jonathan leading the way with Alira right behind him. The tunnel was dark and cramped, but it felt like their only hope. As they moved further, Alira couldn't help but think of the lives that were depending on her. She had to survive. She couldn't let her people down. Suddenly, they reached the end of the tunnel. The exit was just ahead, but as Jonathan pushed open the door, they were met with the sight of an enemy squad waiting for them. Jonathan instinctively stepped in front of Alira, ready to fight, but the soldiers didn't move. Instead, they just stood there, watching. A tall figure stepped forward, his face still hidden behind a mask, but his voice unmistakable. "Well, well, well," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "The queen and her human protector, how predictable." It was Kaelin. Jonathan's heart sank. The traitor had been working with the enemy all along. He was behind the attack, behind everything. "Kaelin," Alira's voice rang out sharp and accusing. "I should have known." Kalen smirked. You should have, but it's too late now, Your Majesty. Your empire is mine. Jonathan moved to protect her, but Alira stopped him, her voice filled with defiance. Not if I have anything to say about it. With a sudden, powerful wave of her hand, Alira sent Kalen flying backward, knocking him to the ground. Jonathan rushed to her side, his heart pounding with pride. She had done it. She had taken control. The soldiers, unsure of what to do, hesitated for a moment. But that was all Jonathan needed. In a blur of movement, he took them down one by one, his skills unmatched. And when the last of Kalen's men lay unconscious on the floor, Alira stood tall, her breath ragged but victorious. We're not done yet, she said, turning to Jonathan, her eyes full of fire. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with admiration. No, we're not. And in that moment, as they stood together side by side, they both knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but their bond was unbreakable. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. After Kalen's betrayal was exposed and his forces defeated, Jonathan and Alira stood in the quiet aftermath, both exhausted but resolute. The enemy was in retreat and the palace was finally secure. Yet, as the dust settled, it wasn't victory they could feel most strongly. It was the weight of everything they had endured together. The silent acknowledgement of their bond was undeniable. Alira, still breathless from the fight, leaned against the stone pillar in the palace courtyard, her eyes cast downward. The adrenaline from the battle had faded, but the chaos and fear were still lingering in her heart. She had come so close to losing everything, including herself. The fear of her people being taken away, of her empire crumbling, had never felt more real. But in that moment she realized something. She wasn't alone. She had Jonathan. Jonathan walked toward her, his steps deliberate, each one weighed with the knowledge of how much he had come to care for her. He could see it in her eyes, the strain of leadership, the cost of bearing the weight of a whole empire. She was strong, yes, but even the strongest needed someone to lean on. And in all the madness, he had found himself wanting to be that someone for her. "You okay?" he asked softly, standing beside her, his voice laced with concern. Alira glanced up at him, offering him a tired smile. "I should be asking you that. You were in the thick of it." Jonathan shrugged, though his chest still throbbed from the fight. "I'm fine, always fine, but are you sure you're okay?" His voice dropped a little, the words coming out more vulnerable than he intended. She let out a deep breath, her eyes searching the distance, as though she were trying to find something out there to hold on to. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could do this on my own, but I was wrong." Jonathan's heart ached hearing those words, especially from her. She had always seemed untouchable, the mighty queen who ruled with strength and grace. But here she was, stripped of her royal armor, her voice filled with vulnerability. "You don't have to do it alone, Alira," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Not anymore. You've got me. I'll always be here for you." Alira turned toward him, meeting his gaze with a seriousness that tugged at his heart. "I know, Jonathan," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You've been here for me through everything, but I've been pushing you away. I didn't want to admit it, but I need you, more than I ever thought I would." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. In that moment he realized how much she meant to him, not just as the queen he was sworn to protect, but as the woman who had captured his heart in ways he hadn't anticipated. The thought of losing her, of seeing her break under the weight of her responsibilities, made him realize how deeply he cared for her. She wasn't just the ruler of an empire. She was someone he loved, someone he would fight for, no matter what. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Alira. You hear me? No matter what happens, I'll be here. I'll protect you, not just because it's my job, but because you matter to me." Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked at him, her breath hitching slightly. "I never thought I could trust anyone like this," she said quietly. "You've become more to me than just a bodyguard, Jonathan. You've become my strength, my support." A rush of warmth spread through Jonathan at her words. He had never imagined that he'd end up here, that he'd find someone who would allow him to be part of her life so intimately. He had always been the protector, the one who stood in the shadows, but with Alira, he felt like he was finally seen for who he was, not just as a soldier, but as a man. Before he could respond, Alira stepped closer, her arms wrapping around him, pulling him into an embrace. The touch was unexpected but felt right, a quiet release of all the tension that had been building between them. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with the weight of everything they had just shared, but then he let go of any hesitation and held her tightly, his arms wrapped around her protectively. "I never thought I'd find this," Alira whispered into his chest, her voice trembling. "Someone who sees me for who I really am, someone who isn't afraid of what I've had to become." Jonathan's fingers brushed through her hair, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm not afraid of you, Alira. I never will be." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the quiet of the palace courtyard, the stars above them witnessing the quiet promise between them. The world outside might have been a storm of war and politics, but in this small moment, it felt like everything was right. Finally, Alira pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a soft, uncertain smile. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I know I want to face it with you, together." Jonathan's heart soared, the emotions he had kept buried finally bubbling to the surface. "I feel the same way. We'll face it together, Alira. No matter what comes, I'm with you." And for the first time in a long time, Alira allowed herself to believe it. She had spent so much of her life pretending to be invincible, pretending that she didn't need anyone. But with Jonathan by her side, she realized that she didn't have to be alone. And that made all the difference. Their lips met in a kiss, slow and tender, the world around them falling away. In that moment there was no more war, no more betrayal, no more fear. There was only them together, united against whatever challenges might come next. And no matter what the future held, Alira knew one thing for sure. With Jonathan by her side, they could conquer anything. The days that followed were filled with both peace and preparation. Alira's empire was on the brink of recovery, but the shadows of betrayal still lingered. With Kaelin's forces scattered and the threat of invasion still hanging over them, Alira and Jonathan stood together, their bond stronger than ever. Jonathan was more than just her protector now, he was her partner. He stood by her side in every decision, every strategy, supporting her in ways she had never imagined. The weight of the crown no longer felt as heavy with him there, sharing in her burdens, and her heart had never felt more at ease. As time passed, the two of them began to rebuild. Jonathan helped Alira navigate the complex political landscape, and together, they strengthened the foundations of her rule. But beyond that, they built a life filled with love and trust. Alira no longer had to face the challenges of leadership alone, and Jonathan found a sense of belonging in a way he had never expected. They had fought side by side through danger, betrayal, and fear. Now they faced the future together, stronger, united, and more in love than ever. And no matter what the galaxy threw at them next, Alira and Jonathan knew they would conquer it as one. Together they were unstoppable,